Hello and welcome to Mythic Mind, where we pursue wisdom on the paths between primary and secondary worlds. I'm your host Andrew Snyder, and I am always grateful for your company. First of all, as a reminder, this is available both as video through YouTube as well as through your favorite podcasting platform. And so, regardless of how you're looking at this, know that the other option is available. And so, if you're listening to the podcast, then I will include the link to the YouTube video in the show notes. And so, go ahead and click on that. Make sure you subscribe to the channel. And if you're watching this on YouTube, then know that the Mythic Mind podcast is also available on your preferred podcasting platform. Well, today we are continuing our conversations on the Poetic Edda, or the Elder Edda as it's sometimes called. This is one of the oldest, one of the most significant collections of text for our understanding of the Northern mythos, of Norse mythology in particular. Norse mythology, Norse legends, Norse epics. And so this is something that none of us who are involved, none of our patrons, nor myself, are at all experts in this material. In fact, I believe that we're all reading this for the first time. Now, obviously, we all have a general interest in this kind of material. Most of us are pretty well acquainted with Tolkien, with Lewis, both of whom drew pretty heavily on the Northern mythos. As well as, a lot of us have some knowledge of broader mythology and mythological themes, but none of us are experts on this material. None of us have ever studied or read this in particular before. And this is not an easy text just to pick up. At least a lot of these readings from the Poetic Edda are not easy just to pick up. And that's because, these are older sources. A lot of what we're dealing with has been redacted, it's been edited over time. Sometimes what we have is not entirely coherent. We have some competing traditions at play sometimes. And so it's just not easy always to piece together. As opposed to something like the Prose Edda, which came a little bit later, which provides a lot of this material in more of a linear, more of a uniform, coherent manner. As well as a lot of the other standalone texts that have come out, things like the Volsung Saga, which also is very old, but it's more recent than the Poetic Edda narrative. And so, in fact, we're going to reference the Volsung Saga a few times. That's something I would definitely recommend that you pick up and read. But when you just read the Poetic Edda, even setting aside the fact that, okay, sometimes we seem to have some maybe incomplete or not fully edited text, as I was talking with Chase, that reading the Poetic Edda for the first time is a lot like reading the Silmarillion for the first time, where you have a broad host of characters, a lot of whom have very similar names. And so the first time through, it can be kind of difficult to keep track of who's who, what's happening, what are all the particular backstories. They kind of blend together the first time through, and it really takes a second full read to get down like what's happening. At least that was my experience with the Silmarillion, and I think that's pretty common. Definitely getting the same vibe with the Poetic Edda. I think that a second full read would help to solidify some of this in our minds. But I think that Chase and I were able to hobble together a productive conversation. I definitely appreciate his role in that. But before we get to that, I do want to give a special thank you to my patrons who help to keep me producing, who help to keep me leading communities and leading these studies and having these kinds of conversations, because I literally could not do it without that financial support. I literally could not afford the time. And this is the kind of thing that I really want to be doing full time. So I really appreciate those of you who help me do what I'm doing right now, and those of you who are setting me up to do more of this in the future. And if you would like to help me do that, if you appreciate what I do and you want to see me do more of it, you want to come along on the road with me, you want to participate in or at least enjoy a broader and more frequent range of things like this, of projects, studies, conversations, then I welcome your support over on patreon.com/mythicmind. But I do want to thank by name all of my Tier 2 patrons and higher, as I've been doing. And we've had some new patrons come in recently, a number who have come in for the current Lord of the Rings study, which just started. This is a study that I just started leading, is called The Wisdom of Tolkien, The Lord of the Rings. And this is a 12-week study through the entirety of The Lord of the Rings, a way to, learn from the wisdom that Tolkien has given us implicitly in these stories. And so each week includes 2 videos, One of which is a shorter wildcard video that covers some element of lore or philosophy or Tolkien's life or a secondary source. Basically, just something to provide a new, fresh angle or some kind of context to what we're reading. And then there's a second, longer video, which runs more or less an hour or so, probably a little bit more, but that covers that week's reading. And so I hope that this is an enriching study that's going to be an enriching study. It already has been for me in preparation and in getting out the first week of material, which is now available. And in fact, our first live meeting is going to be this Thursday, the 9th at 9 p.m. Eastern. And so it's not too late to hop on board. You just need to go to patreon.com/mythicmind and sign on at tier 3 or higher in order to participate. But I do want to read out, probably for the last time, all of my tier 2 patrons and higher. I say for the last time simply because this is a big group now at tier 2 or higher. And so I think that after today, I'm going to move to just mentioning by name tier 3 patrons. Not because I don't appreciate my tier 2s, but just because there are just so many at this point. And again, I do truly appreciate you. And so thank you to all tier 2 patrons and higher. And that is Mark, Aaron, Evie, Jamie, Mariah, Paul, Tyler, William, Aaron, Andrew G, Andrew M, Arturo, Brandon, Christopher, Emmy, Ian, Jeremiah, Jocelyn, Josh B, Josh T, Landon, Matthew, Sarah, and Steele. And of course, thank you to all tier 1 patrons as well. And again, if you want to join to either just support my work or to gain access to the ad-free podcast feed or to enroll in the Lord of the Rings study, go to patreon.com/mythicmind. But now let's go ahead and get to my conversation with Chase regarding the next set of readings from the Poetic Edda. All right, so welcome back as we continue our chats on the Poetic Edda. Today I'm joined by Chase, and it's just the two of us. And so I'm just saying, I hope he's ready to carry that load because there's a lot going on here that, it's kind of like reading the Silmarillion for me, which, I mean, knowing Tolkien, that's kind of by design. It makes sense. There's a connection there. You've got so many different names that many of which sound very familiar, so many different things happening, interweaving plots, and with the Silmarillion, it took me a couple of reads to really just get down like what's happening.
Yeah.
And I feel like I need another full read of the Edda to really nail this down. But I don't know. What's been your just general experience so far trying to read the Edda for the first time?
So when I read through the prose edda, that one helped a lot because it just kind of like gave a basis for everything. And I started seeing how, all of modern entertainment that's anything Norse related really pulls from that, even in the smallest ways. Um, and it also kind of helps knowing what some of the characters in terms of like Thor, like how he typically acts or how Odin typically acts. Um, Overall, I've liked it. I think so. I finished the prose edda before this month one, but the previous ones I hadn't, and those were still kind of confusing to me. So I may need to reread those just to see how I felt.
Yeah, I think that's a good idea. I was just saying that I've started the prose edda. Definitely need to finish it. I think that would shed a lot of light here. The prose edda, which came a little bit after the poetic edda, but it's arranged in a much more linear kind of way, a lot more straightforward. As far as opposed to the poetic edda, where we're dealing with older source material, a lot of it isn't totally coherent as we have it because we've got fragments of different poems that
Hmm.
they change. Sometimes there are gaps. Even our Larrington, who translated and gives some commentary in this edition, she notes a number of times that sometimes what we have just is not fully coherent, and so it's
Hmm.
difficult to work it out with that alone. Now, for some of the ones that we're going to get into today, we're starting to approach the Volsungs. And so
Right.
definitely would recommend anyone who's listening to this to read the saga of the Volsungs, which Chase, you've read that, right?
Have. Yep.
Yeah, yeah. Which again lays out a lot of this material, but in more of a coherent, straightforward manner. I wish I had the time to do a reread. I read it a few months ago, but at least having that somewhere in my head has definitely helped to piece some of this together as far as who's who and what's happening.
Yeah.
But yeah. We'll get to some of that, but before we get to the Volsung stuff, the first poem, the first reading in this set that we're doing this week, is called "All Wisest Sayings." So we've got a little bit about Thor again before we shift gears to the Volsungs, and as I've been doing, I'll just read the introduction provided by Larrington here. Thor intercepts a dwarf who apparently, and unbeknown to Thor, is intending to marry the latter's daughter. Thor proposes a wisdom contest in which he tests the dwarf's knowledge of the terminology used by the different races of being for natural phenomena. The dwarf knows a striking range of kennings and perhaps taboo words, but Thor's secret aim is to delay him until the sun comes up and turns him to stone. I guess that's kind of enough of that. Um, so out of the readings for this time, this is definitely, I think, the easiest read. Um,
Hmm.
but at the same time, at least on my end, I probably have the least to say about it. Um, did anything stand out to you about this reading, or anywhere you want to go with this?
Yeah, so I think a couple things I kind of got, and I listened to some discussion about it, and kind of um, even an interview with Larrington, and she was talking about how she had to kind of like look in other texts and find stuff. But this one, the main thing I pulled from it was it really just seems like, this is a time when Thor comes back. The dwarf is asking, not asking, he's telling, like, I would like your permission, but I'm going to take it anyway to take your daughter. And, Thor typically comes in like with the hammer swinging, ready to like knock everybody out. But I think here is the rules of like hospitality since he's in his home. He can't just immediately, I mean, I guess he's done that sometimes, but here he's respecting that and not immediately murdering the dwarf. And so, um, yeah, it's kind of a different one with that. And so I think, uh, yeah, just basically Thor kind of having restraint.
Yeah, and maybe there is some cultural element here, maybe something about hospitality. Maybe it's just the fact that we do have a number of different traditions of Thor coming together, where this does seem a little bit out of character for him for to. Um, I mean, he's not exactly pleasant in the long run, but he's more cunning than just hammer ablazing. Um,
Right.
because we've got this lore contest that they get into, which seems to happen fairly regularly within the Edda, where they go back and forth arguing, not even so much just about lore, but it's about like what do different people call different things. It's more like a
Hmm.
terminology debate. In all these lore debates, because I'm coming to this material from first starting with Tolkien and Lewis. These lore debates always make me think of Ransom's fight with Merlin when he first shows up. And they're like fighting for dominance, talking about all these different elements of the cosmos and mythology and whatnot.
Yeah.
Yeah, it always makes me think of that, which I'm sure that's the tradition that Lewis is pulling from for that. Um,
Yeah, for sure. I think you're right. Um, I do think it's funny when he says, he says, maybe I'm reading into this, but when he says, like, tell me this, all wise, I reckon dwarf. And it kind of almost seems like he's kind of just like, I know your name's all wise, but I'm still like, you're just a dwarf to me, like, you're nothing. But I don't know, I'm probably reading that into, but he says it every single time. Um, I reckon dwarf, you have wisdom about all things. So I don't know if that's like a demeaning way of talking, or he's just that's the way he wrote it. I don't know.
it very well may be. I know that Thor has killed his number of dwarves and usually doesn't hold them in very high esteem. So
Yeah,
that's definitely very possible that he's demonstrating the irony of referring to this dwarf as all wise. So that's
right.
definitely possible. Um, and of course, his whole strategy here, where the lore or the actual fight isn't actually what this story's about. The story's about Thor's cunning, and he's just keeping the debate going until daybreak when the dwarf turns to stone,
Hmm.
which then reminds me, of course, of The Hobbit, where Gandalf gets the trolls arguing until daybreak, where they turn to stone. There's
Yeah,
definitely a connection there. Um,
yeah, definitely. Um, let's see. from some discussions on it, I did see that people had the thought that it could have been like this could have been almost a way of teaching children the different words for things or something, kind of like a, oh, what do you call this? This is what each of the mythical beings called it, you know?
That makes a lot of sense. I actually kind of like that. It's like a teaching strategy.
Yeah,
I'm going to find some way to make use of that.
yeah. Um, we learn a little bit about the dwarf's like appearance when he calls him, what is it, like pale face? Uh, is it, where was that? I saw that.
It does sound familiar.
Maybe that was a different translation. Oh no, why so pale about the nostrils? Did you spend the night with a corpse? I think it, just like he spends so much time underground that he's just a very pale creature.
And then we get the kind of insults we tend to get from Thor and his fellows.
Yeah.
That's funny. Um,
I do wonder what they use the word liquid fundament, which Larrington doesn't really know. I mean, she's just like, we don't know what this word is. And so it is kind of cool seeing all the different ways that they're describing something um, in terms of like or is it like with rain or something, it being like roof dripping or something like that.
yeah, it's a very descriptive language. It's one of the reasons why even I can't read the original, but in translation, reading this or reading like Beowulf or anything from this general time and region, the language is so cool, like so visual, so descriptive. They have
Hmm.
so many different ways of referring to what we tend to think of as like objects. They turn into actions almost. They're turned into process, which I think that kind of adds an extra energy to the language. What's going on?
Um, they talked about the Dwalen's clay thing when they're talking about the sun,
Hmm.
which I think is just kind of playing with that the sun turns them to stone. So, because Dwalen is a dwarf, so he obviously wouldn't be playing with the sun, I guess.
Right. Um, which also is probably where we get Tolkien's dwarf dwelling, I assume.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, and don't know that I have much else to say about this one. Anything else? All
No,
right.
it's pretty just straightforward.
Yeah. Yeah, that's the shorter one. It's a more straightforward one. Now we get into the poems that I keep mixing up in my head. The three poems with Helgi, well, two different Helgis, who are also might be the same person. Um,
Yeah.
so let's okay. Let's see if
Why
I
would you
even
be
want to.
confused by that? Come on.
Yeah, and then of course uh, yeah, the way that this is arranged, where okay, first we're dealing with the first poem of Helgi Hundingsbani. Um, and well, I guess we'll just take this one at a time. Okay, we'll start there. Um, so in this poem, Helgi is the son of Sigmund, who is one of the major figures in the Volsung saga. Which, again, anyone listening to this, I recommend reading the Volsung saga. I did after I read it, put together a short summary video. I'll link that in the show notes if anyone wants to look at that. I may even just for convenience sake drop the audio into the end of this episode. And so if anyone wants to just kind of get that the basic story down as we get in the more worked out saga, then you can just listen to that and then jump back here. Now, so Helgi is the son of Sigmund, as well as Sinfiotli, which they're half brothers, different moms. Um, in that Sinfiotli is actually the son of Sigmund as and his sister, which gives us some Children of Hurin vibes for sure, if anyone's read that. Um, uh, but again, just listen to that story. We don't rehash that here. So we got Sinfiotli, who joined with Zygmunt on various raids when Zygmunt was kind of like an outlaw type figure, and so they raided off together. Helgi was born of Zygmunt in Borghild, and so they're half siblings. But after Zygmunt dies at the hands of the Saxon king Hunding, Helgi sets off to avenge his father, which is a regular occurrence in the saga of avenging your kinsmen when they're killed by somebody so and so. So Helgi goes off, he kills Hunding with Sinfiotli, kill Hunding's children, and in the process meets up with um, the Valkyrie, who is was it who is it in this one? What's her name?
Is it Sigrun in this one?
Yes,
The next one.
yes, yes. So Sigrun, and so but she is already promised to this guy Hodbrod, this prince, I believe, at this point, yeah, Hodbrod. But she doesn't like him very much, and so she basically commissions Helgi to go off and kill him, so that way they can be together. And that's what takes place, and that's basically the gist of this poem. Um, all right, that's probably as succinctly as I can put that together. Um,
There you go.
so, what do you have to say about this?
Yeah, I was trying to remember all the Volsung Saga as I was reading through this. It's interesting with these poems, just it's they're so like similar, but it's like different chunks and different kind of like interpretations. Um, yeah, I'm not exactly sure. Yeah, I noticed the Sinfiotli and Gudmund, Gudmund later on, they're kind of exchanging, insults again, as one does in any kind of Norse
Right.
literature.
Right. Before that last kind of major battle, they get into this insult fight where they can get into each other's backstories. I mean, um, Gudrun says that Sinfiotli killed his brothers, which I mean, he did, because Zygmunt's sister, who wait, was Zygmunt's sister? Is that Zygni? Is that right?
Um,
Do you remember from the
yes,
Volsungs?
yes.
Um, yes, and so Zigny is basically taken against her will as this foreign king's wife, and she, I mean, out of spite for this king that she's married to, basically gets Sinfiotli to kill her children that she had with him, and so he does, indeed kill his brothers, and so that's brought up against him. As well as there's a reference to when Zygmunt and Sinfiotli wore these enchanted wolf skins that basically turned them to werewolves. And so, these rampages that he used to engage with, those are brought up here.
Hmm.
And then as there usually is, there's some, some sexual insults thrown at each other. Um,
Yeah,
I can't remember offhand even where those were, but I remember coming across them.
yeah. Basically, saying you were dressed as like one of their daughters or something, and it's just that was the Sinfiotli and Gudmund, and later on too.
Yeah, there's some reference. I can't even remember if this is in this one or the other poem, which kind of repeats a lot of this, but in a different way. There's some mention about him getting into some guy's armor, like, yeah. So all sorts of things like that, like we've seen from this point. Um, Now, one thing I thought was interesting about this poem begins by talking about the Norns, who are the Norse fates, essentially, right? They're the ones who weave together the fates of the gods and of men. And so it starts off in the second stanza saying, Night fell on the estate, then came Norns, those who shape fate for the prince. And so it's a sense that everything that we're about to read is happening according to fate, which it's not uncommon for these northern tales to be very clear that things are happening according to fate, which gets to this idea that the kind of the what happens in the story is not the point of the story. The point of the story is the hero's relationship to fate and really how he receives that. And so it's the idea that like things are going to happen as they're going to happen, but I guess the question is, are you going to fulfill your destiny by receiving it, or are you going to fight against it? And we see that the path of honor that Helgi carries out is the one that just kind of accepts his fate. Like, um, well, I guess this connects to the next poem about Helgi. So maybe I'll say my hand on that. Um, it's hard to talk about this in a straightforward way. Um, I don't
Well, you
know.
jump between them.
Yeah,
This one's kind of like I felt like this one was the not as in depth of what's
yeah,
happening. I think it took like till the last three to kind of get what's going on.
yeah. So I guess we can kind of jump around some. And should we go ahead and talk about the poem of? Well, actually, one thing I do just want to mention is kind of in passing. Even the name of Helgi, he's referred to as Helgi Hundingsbani, which that um, we think of his last name, but it's really more of a title. Speaks to the fact that he is the bane of Hunding. He's Hunding's bane, right? Hunding being this killer of his father that then he goes off and kills, and so he is the bane of Hunding, which again gives us some of precedence for Tolkien's language, like when he refers to Isildur's bane or Durin's bane as these things that did them in. He's very much just using this northern kind of language, which I just think is an interesting connection. Um, but yeah, I guess we can go ahead and talk a little bit about the poem of Helgi Hiorvardson, which really just jumps back to a different Helgi, maybe at least a different version of Helgi.
Yeah.
Um, and so in this poem, which I don't really know if I can summarize all this, with so we've got this king. Well, maybe I'll just read the introduction. Helgi Hiorvardson is a kind of doublet of Helgi Hundingsbani, whose two poems surround his in the manuscript. The poem of Helgi Hiorvardson follows the basic plot of the other Helgi poems with an added prelude telling of the winning of Helgi's mother. This sets up Helgi's first adventure, killing his mother's disgruntled former wooer. Then comes a flighting between the hero's lieutenant, Atli, and a troll woman, Hrimgerd, the marriage with the Valkyrie, and the death at the hands of the son of his former enemy. Compared with the other two Helgi poems, the plot in this poem is less coherent. The fighting between Atli and Hurmgard parallels that in the previous poem, and Hayden's vow has no clear tragic consequences. He simply acquires his brother's bride after his death. The poem ends before we know whether Hayden dies avenging Helgi or whether he and Svava find love together. So there's some parallels between this poem and the other poems. We're dealing again with a guy named Helgi, and some kind of similar things take place here. He falls in love with the Valkyrie Svava, um, who who is or who will kind of reincarnate into the Valkyrie of the other poems. And it's at least heavily implied that the Helgi of the other poems is not merely named after this Helgi, but he is the reincarnated Helgi, the one and the same. And so we get these lovers, this Helgi and the Valkyrie, who die and then they get reincarnated again and sort of play out similar roles in another lifetime. Um, yeah, I guess that's enough background. What do you have to say about this?
I do think it's funny that she shows like, hey, this is the least coherent compared to the other two, which are not super coherent.
Correct. So it's definitely comforting to read that.
Yeah. Um, yeah, I think throughout these poems, I think just to remember that like it's the family of like Sigmund and then the Hundings are enemies, just hostile towards each other. So it's just a consistent like trade-off of like, oh, you killed my kinsman, I'm gonna come kill you, or and then you bring in the third portion, which is just like, hey, this is somebody that like loved that woman, but she didn't return the feelings, so now we got to kill him. But then his sons are going to try and come kill us. So it's just a cycle of like revenge. Um,
Right, right. Which I think is a major point of a lot of these poems is that well, actually, I don't know what the point is because, on one hand, it'd be easy to read this and get out of it like the futility of the cycle of revenge, but at the same time, like the revenge is built into the honor system of these people. And so it's like, is it even really criticism or just a way of saying like, this is how things are?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think it would be like very much different than what was happening there. You know, like these are obviously built off of what's happening in, you know, in history, you know, so that's around that time, I'm sure people were killing each other and avenging and you're talking about it. But um, I did notice it said Otley, but I don't know if that's supposed to be like, I know in other poems, Otley was like Attila the Hun, but I don't know if that isn't this one.
Yeah, it doesn't. I had that confusion at first too, but it seems to be two different people in my reading,
Hmm.
in that Atli seems to be basically the commander of Helgi or like one of his lieutenants,
Hmm.
and based on context, it wouldn't make sense for that to be Attila the Hun, and so I can only assume
Right.
those are two different people. But yeah, I thought about that as well.
Yeah. And I think that one comes later anyway, because that would have been that's with like Brynhild and everything.
Right.
Um, let's see. This does bring back him listening to the birds, makes me think of when, is it Fafnir's Slade
Mm-hmm.
by Sigurd?
Sigurd.
Sigurd, yeah. And he's able to hear the birds speaking, which ends up being negative for him. But here, I was starting to read it, and I was like, "Oh no, birds are talking. It's trouble now because they must lie, or just
Yeah, yeah. I assume understanding birds is some sign of wisdom, probably connected to like Odin and his ravens. Odin being associated with wisdom, which in this context, wisdom is not always necessarily a good thing. It's more like just knowledge more than anything else,
Mhm.
which could be a good thing or it could not be a good thing. And I guess we don't get assigned it's necessarily a bad thing here, although Helgi does seem to get the sense that he is marked by fate, especially toward the end of the story. So I don't know. Maybe this he's always been kind of a doomed type of figure, which is again definitely a theme that Tolkien liked to pick up, especially in the Silmarillion.
Mhm. Yeah, and Atlee is at least clever enough to not just make an open-ended, yeah, I'll sacrifice anything to you from the, you know, um, anything he wishes from the king's court. He like lays out like, I'm not going to kill like the brides of the king, um, or any of his sons. So good on Atlee.
Right. Yeah, and then again we get a fighting or the insult competition match. Um, this time between was was this between Atli and the troll woman,
Mm.
Hurmgerd, which again ends in her turning into stone because they keep up the argument till sunrise, and so um, it just kind of repeat of the same idea there.
And I even feel like it's, yeah, he's speaking to him and doesn't, how the hell he got in there? Maybe it was once. Oh, that's what it was. They're doing kind of an insult, and then
Right, and then Helgi gets pulled in.
he, yeah, Helgi gets pulled in, and he's like, "All right, Atlee, are you gonna, sleep with this ogre?" And he's like,
Right,
"No, I'm
right,
not."
right.
The worst of the lava dwelling ogres. He's a fitting mate for you. That's a good insult. So,
Yeah, yeah. Save that one for Twitter. Um, yeah, and then kind of jumping toward the end, and we can always go back if need be. But toward the end, we find that Helgi's after Helgi's won all these great conquests and great glories, then his brother Hayden back home um, has somebody approach him. Who was it? It was like a some kind of like witch or something. I don't remember. Troll. Can't remember. Something of that sort of nature approaches
yeah,
him and wants him to get together with her, to sleep with her or something. And he
Hmm.
says no. So then she dooms him essentially. And so then he gets into, he gets into the ale, right? He starts drinking and then pledges that he's going to have Svava, his brother's Valkyrie wife. Um, and um, then he comes to, and he's recognizes in his sobriety that he made a big mistake, but even Helgi recognizes that a there's like something sacred about what's said over ale. And so he says, all right, well, now we have to duel over this, and there's no way out of it. And that's how Helgi dies.
Yeah, it's
It's interesting.
even back then they're realizing, when you're drunk or making a pledge over drinks, you're typically going to say what's fully on your mind. Takes all the inhibitions out. Um, yeah, this troll woman riding a wolf with serpents as reins. I'm surprised he said no. I mean, it just seems like
It's
such a
very appealing. Yeah.
welcoming companion. But yeah, I
Yeah.
mean,
Yeah. Go ahead.
just it's a weird reaction from Helgi where he's just like not immediately like taken aback, like this is the woman that I love, and you're trying to sleep there. He's like, I'm probably gonna die, so you just this may turn out good for you. Just wait.
Right. It's like he's not really concerned with the outcome or the dishonor that he's been dealt with. He just recognizes his brother needs to uphold his honor and, do what he set out to do.
Yeah.
And so he's just totally okay with his duel. But yeah, it is interesting that we think today that, if somebody clearly inebriated, that, okay, you're not going to put too much stock in what they're saying. But yeah, as you said, they really understand that. No, alcohol tends to actually bring out what's really in your heart. And so it's actually more binding, not less binding. And
Hmm.
so yeah, just it's interesting that Helgi is totally kind of okay with this on an emotional level. I definitely think that it's not a bad idea to read like the Stoics, like Marcus Aurelius or something, alongside this Northern literature because it's so much like against the emotional. It's just this is the path of honor. This is what I need to go out and do. Um, yeah, and so that is indeed how Helgi dies. Um, and then it says here we get a prose conclusion right at the end after he dies, that Helgi and Svava are said to have been reincarnated, and then that's how it ends, which sets us up for the other Helgi and his Valkyrie bride or Valkyrie lover. That seems to be them reincarnated. Although it's interesting that at the end of the second poem of Helgi Hundingsbani, our narrator pops in and says that reincarnation is like a old wives' tale of the pagans. And so I can only assume this is some kind of Christian narrator saying that, okay, this is all bunk, it's just a story.
There was a belief in pagan times. That is crazy that it like that. Um, like with the prose that I know Snorri had left out some things that were more pagan and more kind of out there, and kind of had inserted more of what he thought with Christian stuff, and kind of made it clear. Uh,
Yeah, I mean, even in his introduction to the Prose Edda, Snorri tries to kind of humanize the gods even and say
mhm.
that, they came from Troy. Like
Yeah.
he's trying to, while giving us the pagan mythos, he's kind of demythologizing it somewhat. He's trying to sanitize some of it, make it a little bit more palatable to a Christian audience. But I
Hmm.
was surprised that even in the Prose Edda, to get this epilogue where it just makes this reference to pagan times,
Hmm.
just very very straightforward. Well, we've kind of jumped around a bit. So whether we're dealing with this second poem of Hundingsbani or whatever, I don't know, what's something else on your mind?
Yeah, this so it definitely doesn't tell us whatever happens. I know Hedden rides out to avenge. Um, we aren't told if he ends up being with Svava before she dies.
Hmm.
Um, but yeah, in both of these, it's talking about how he meets the same fate, right? He fights. is it the original or the poem was Alf, son of Rodmore. So it was avenging his father, killing Helgi, and then can't remember if the second one was the same thing. No, it said Dag, so that was a little different. That it was
Because the second one has some, it seems to echoing a repetition of what happens in the first poem, but then it takes it further. Um, in that we still have the Valkyrie wants Helgi to go and kill Holbrod. After so he kills Hunding, and then he goes off to kill Holbrod. But then the story kind of goes on from there, which is going to lead to this Helgi's death from what was it, Dag or
so Dog is Hogni's son. So that would have been
right,
Sigrun's father. I guess Sigrun's brother, maybe a half brother, maybe a full brother. But instead of being
right,
Rodmore's son, it's Hogni's son that fights him. Um,
yeah. So there's some similarity there. Um, and I do think it's interesting that let's see, Dog, when he so that's so Dog is Sigrun the Valkyrie's sister, right? And so he's the one who's going to kill Helgi in this rendition. And it says that okay, he sets off to kill him, and he basically he makes a sacrifice to Odin, and so Odin kind of gives him the ability to kill Helgi. And Odin is just such an interesting character. He shows up a few times in the Volsung saga, where sometimes he's helping the Volsungs, and then he'll just randomly show up and bring about their death. Which is what happens to Sigmund, I believe. It was in the father of Helgi, where Sigmund was in this battle, and then Odin shows up and basically like, shatters his sword, and then that leads him to be defenseless. So then he dies. The sword, which would then be reforged by Sigurd, giving us strong Narsil vibes, but that's beside the point. Um, and so, yeah, Odin just kind of shows up, and he shows up again at the end of the Volsung saga to kill off the last Volsung, essentially. And so Odin, he's always stirring up these conflict between these peoples, these dynasties, these families, and he's always like raising up a powerful warrior and then conspiring to bring about his death because he's trying to fill Valhalla with these great warriors for Ragnarok, and so he's got his own ends at play here.
yeah, I mean, that makes sense because if these are men that would not have fallen in battle, they probably would have died of old age because they were stronger than everybody else. Obviously, Odin's going to need to find a way to find the loophole so that they don't go to underworld with hell. Um,
Right, right, and so he builds them up and then makes sure that they die in battle.
yeah, the
But then, I mean, to be fair, Helgi is, made to be like his right hand man in Valhalla.
yeah, not a bad way to go.
Yeah,
Uh, I guess until the end, but um, the what was it? Yeah, in this one we see Sigrun actually go and find Hodbrod on like the point of death, laying in the field and just being like, "Yeah, I'm not gonna sink into your arms, bro. You're actually gonna have you know, y'all are all gonna be eaten by wolves." Um,
right. Harsh.
so it's like, all right, Helgi just likes really metal women, I guess.
Yeah, I guess
So
so. Yeah, I mean, at one point, she is even referred to as their battle goddess, and so yeah, definitely very very metal.
very Valkyrie, very really, um, yeah, just fighting.
Yeah,
This one brings in something that the other one doesn't in terms of meeting Helgi at the burial mound. Um,
yeah.
once they, I don't know if he's like in ghost form or just has not like fully laid down yet. What did you get from that? Were you seeing if it was like, I mean, this is just
It's
like not fully dead or?
Yeah, it seems to be that he has kind of some ability to, even though he lives with Odin, sometimes at night he's able to sort of cross that veil, and, appear in his burial ground. And I think it's interesting that I think, and I could be mixing up the poems, but I think it was in the poem of Helgi Hiorvardson where it says that he was toward the beginning of the poem where it says that he was sitting on basically a burial mound and he saw Valkyries passing by. And so there's some kind of connection here. I don't know
Mhm.
exactly what that is, but there's some connection here with the Helgis, with burial mounds, this idea of sort of like living on the edge of things, having some connection to the beyond, the other. And so Helgi seems to have this sort of special, I don't know, liminal sort of existence at this point, where by day he's with Odin and by night he's able to visit with Helgi or with um Sigrun at the burial
Yeah.
mound.
Yeah, and even I mean maybe it's something to do with like he's destined for Valhalla or Valhalla or whatever.
Yeah,
You know, where he's on the burial mound seeing the Valkyries and then later coming out and with Odin with like you were saying.
hmm.
But it seems like they just spent one night together and then he was occupied. I before we get to that part, it talks about Odin just throw or I guess Helgi throws in that Hunding is basically like a servant in
Right.
in Odin's Valhalla.
Right. Yeah, we're told that Helgi is made, basically. So he's asked to rule over everything in Valhalla alongside Odin. And the first thing he says is, Hunding, you shall fetch the foot bath. It just
Yeah,
puts him in his place.
yeah. Scores were apparently not settled when he killed him.
Yeah, man, that'd be awful. Get killed, and
Yeah,
even in Valhalla, that's your fate. So Sigrun has this encounter with Helgi at the burial mound. Next day, she seems to not be there, and then we're told that she didn't live long for sorrow and for grief. And so that's really how the story ends. Um, and I don't know. I mean, do you have anything else to say?
not a whole lot. Kind of went over the stuff in this one. I know that it said that this was told in a basically in a source that was lost at the time. So Song of
Hmm.
Kara. Um, but yeah, I do feel that Volsung Saga kind of does a little clearer, a little more straight line than this is. But it's cool kind of seeing different, maybe how it was told in different places.
Yeah, and from what I remember in the Volsung saga, does it even go into? I know that Helgi going off to kill Hunding. I know that's mentioned in the saga, but I feel like we get more detail about Helgi in this version.
I think you're right. I think it just kind of like briefly summarizes that, oh, these are like the ancestors, and then kind of moves on. So his family's just destined for Valkyries, I guess.
I guess so. Which I mean, it's connected to the fact that they're specially marked by Odin, who
Hmm.
Valkyrie's obviously associated with Odin. Um, yeah, and so that is the story of the Helgis.
There we go.
All right. Well, um, don't know that I have a great conclusion here. Do you have anything to like recommend? Anything you've been reading recently outside of this?
So I actually joined another book club, and we're working our way through. It's nothing to do with this. It's actually a Japanese book, Shipwrecks, which is kind of interesting to see, like what fish. It's like a fishing village and kind of life there, and like the 1800s, I think, late 1800s, early 1900s, and so kind of does give a feeling of what life would have been like on a fishing type village in anywhere in the world, I guess. But
That's
interesting.
cool. Yeah, it's definitely different. That's cool. Um, my, I mean, basically everything that I've been reading recently is related to Tolkien for this Tolkien class that I'm leading now. But I've really enjoyed. I don't have it around me right now. Um, but the well, let me see if I can look it up real fast, and I'll probably cut out here where I'm just looking. I'll edit that out.
Okay.
Yeah, I really like the Reader's Companion to Lord of the Rings by Hammond and Skull, which it's such a detailed commentary on Lord of the Rings. It provides all kinds of backstory connections to biographical connections in Tolkien's life. It points you to
Oh,
letters, points you to where to look in history of Middle Earth, look like other drafts of that section of the reading. It's like a super detailed commentary that runs all throughout Lord of the Rings, which is just great for just compiling all this stuff, secondary information, but also pointing you to when you want to look more about the backstory of this character or like what this looks like in different drafts and whatnot. It's just a great kind of hub to get to all these different areas, and so I can't believe I haven't come across this before. Um,
yeah.
uh, but yeah, so that's definitely something I'd recommend for studying Tolkien. Yeah.
Yeah, that's good. I sometimes I see those and I'm always like, okay, who's writing kind of a gimmick, just to like if it's a reading companion, you're like, do I really need that? But that sounds like it's actually very informative and good.
Yeah. Yeah. Basically anything with the Hammond and Skull authors or editors on there, it seems to be pretty reliable. And I'm still, all things considered, relatively new to Tolkien. I mean, I know some people spent like their whole life reading him. I
Hmm.
first started in, I don't know, 2021, I think. I've just been going nonstop since then. But yeah, and so I'm still discovering all kinds of new stuff. So yeah, that's definitely something I would recommend. Um,
Awesome.
well, cool. So yeah, next time we'll cover the next probably four readings or so, but I'll post that in the Discord. But otherwise, I guess that's where we'll go ahead and end it off. So thanks again for joining us and for carrying probably more than half of the conversation.
I appreciate it, man. It was good.
You got it. The saga begins with Siggi, who is introduced as a son of Odin, giving him legendary status from the beginning and letting us know that Odin will be taking a special interest in this line. Siggi was in fellowship with Skadi, a man of greater stock and power than he, who owned a thrall named Bredi, who excelled in skill and accomplishments. One day, Siggi took Bredi hunting for the entire day and into the evening, and Bredi proved himself to be the superior hunter, much to Siggi's disappointment. Unable to accept the wound to his pride, wrought by being bested by a mere thrall, Siggi attacked and killed Bredi and buried his corpse in a snowdrift. When Skadi asked about the venture, Siggi attempted to lie, but the truth became known and Siggi was driven away as an outlaw. With guidance from Odin, Siggi and a company provided by his father became fearsome raiders, and Siggi eventually became a great and powerful king of Hunland, the exact location of which is difficult to pin down, but according to Snorri Sturluson, the 13th century compiler of the Prose Edda, this is likely somewhere in France. As Siggi grew in years and prestige, his wife's brothers, who held his trust, conspired against him, reminding us of Siggi's previous betrayal of his trusting hunting companion. Siggi's in-laws assaulted his land and killed the aged king who was caught unprepared. Siggi's son, Rayrir, was not present during the attack. He gathered together a company of trusted companions and local chieftains, and he took back his father's land and claimed his inheritance as king. Once he was well established, Rayrir was faced with competing obligations to his kin and to his father's honor, a tense ethical position that is often found in the great Germanic legends. However, because of his uncle's great sins, Rayrir no longer counted their ties of kinship to be binding, and he honored his father with vengeance, striking down his killers and claiming more land, wealth, and power than his father ever had. During these exploits, he also took a wife, but they were unable to produce an heir, and so they implored the gods until Frigga heard their prayers and asked Odin to intervene. Odin sent one of his Valkyries, Hlod, the daughter of the giant Hrymnir, to bring an apple of fertility to King Rerir, and she did so, dropping the apple on the king's lap. He ate of the apple, and the queen was soon found to be with child. The pregnancy lasted long, and when King Rerir was away on a campaign, he took sick and died. In distress, the queen could not give birth for 6 years, at which point the child was finally cut out of her. The child kissed his mother, and then she breathed her last, as her life by this point was utterly spent. The boy was given the name Volsung, and he was a king and a warrior who surpassed his fathers before him. Volsung eventually married Hlod, the Valkyrie who brought the apple to his father, thereby introducing a semi-incestuous melody, if not exactly, then at least in a manner that rhymes with events that are yet to come. Volsung and Hlod bore 10 sons and 1 daughter. The eldest were the twins, Sigmund and his sister Signy. Signy's hand in marriage was requested by Siggeir, king of Gautland, and although Signy was reluctant, she honored her father's direction to accept the proposal. During a feast held to celebrate this union, a stranger entered the hall. He wore a mottled cape and hood, he was barefoot, and he had only one eye, which reveals to us that this was, in fact, none other than the All-Father Odin. This stranger brandished a magnificent sword and thrust it into the great tree that grew through the middle of the hall, and he made the declaration that whoever could draw the sword from the trunk shall receive it as a gift, and this would be a sword better than any of them had ever borne. Each of the noblest of men made their attempts, but to no avail. Finally, Sigmund, son of King Volsung, grasped his hand around the hilt and pulled it out with no effort whatsoever. It was he who would bear this great sword of the Allfather. King Siggeir offered to buy the sword for triple its weight in gold, to which Sigmund answered, "You could have taken the sword from where it stood, no less than I did, if it were meant for you to carry it. But now that it has come first into my hands, you will never obtain it, even if you should offer me all the gold you own." Siggeir was deeply offended at this, but, being an underhanded and deceitful man, he plotted his revenge in silence rather than demonstrating open scorn. Siggeir decided to leave for home the next day, but Signy implored her father to annul the marriage, for she was informed by her gift of foresight that misery would otherwise follow. King Volsung did not see sufficient reason to commit this dishonor, and so he told his daughter to continue with her new life as so agreed. Before leaving, Siggeir invited Volsung and his sons to visit him in Gautland in 3 months' time, and Volsung agreed to the offer. When the appointed time came, Signy called her father and brothers together for a private conversation. She informed them that Siggeir had gathered an unbeatable army and that he had intended to betray the Volsung clan, and she implored them to flee. King Volsung declared that he would not betray his pride and his honor, but that he and his men would instead stand and fight. With fierce and valiant combat, Volsung charged the hostile forces of Siggeir, but Volsung's forces were no match for the overwhelming power of Siggeir's. King Volsung fell in battle, and his 10 sons were taken captive. Signy pleaded with her husband on behalf of her brothers, but he agreed only that they should not be immediately hewed down, but that they would instead be subject to torture and lingering deaths. The sons of Volsung were pinned down under a great trunk in the woods, and every night a she-wolf, who may have actually been King Siggeir's mother, transformed by sorcery, would arrive to feast on one of the brothers. This continued every night until only Sigmund was left. Before the final night that would have claimed his life as well, Signy instructed one of her trusted servants to smear honey on Sigmund's face and into his mouth. When the she-wolf arrived that evening, she did not instantly devour him, but first licked the sweet honey off his face and reached her tongue into his mouth, allowing Sigmund to bite the wolf's tongue, causing the great wolf to recoil back and split the trunk that held his feet. As she recoiled, Sigmund did not release her tongue from his teeth, causing it to be sundered from her mouth. With this great wound, the she-wolf bled out and died, and Sigmund was free to take his leave. Sigmund then took up residence in the woods as an outlaw, while Siggeir believed that he had killed the last of the Volsungs, save for his wife. Signy had 2 sons with Siggeir, whom she sent one at a time to aid Sigmund and to potentially serve as companions of revenge against Siggeir, her husband. However, both proved to be cowards, so Signy, bearing no love for her husband or his offspring, asked Sigmund to kill them, which he did without remorse. One day, when Signy was sitting in her chamber, a sorceress appeared to her. Signy requested that the sorceress change appearances with her, and, with this magic in effect, Signy went to Sigmund's home in the forest, seduced him, and laid with him for 3 nights. Sometime later, she gave birth to a son, Sinfiotli, who grew to be large and strong. Sigmund and Sinfiotli raided together, sometimes as men and sometimes with the guise of enchanted wolfskins. Once Sinfiotli was fully grown, Sigmund was ready to avenge his father by striking at King Siggeir. Late in the evening, Sigmund and Sinfiotli hid themselves among ale caskets outside Sigurd's main hall. By this point, Signy and Sigurd had 2 more young sons who were playing with golden toys, and as a golden ring rolled down the hall, the boys chased after it. Sigmund and Sinfiotli presented themselves with terrifying appearance to these children, and Signy told Sigmund to kill them, but Sigmund stays his hand this time. Sinfiotli, however, has no qualms with dispatching his half-brothers, and he swiftly does so. Their bodies were then cast into the hall of King Sigurd, who called the guards to his defense. Sigmund and Sinfiotli fought valiantly, but they were eventually overpowered, bound and fettered, and sealed alive in a stone cairn. However, Signy had subtly provided them with provisions, including Sigmund's great sword given to him by Odin. With this noble blade, Sigmund cut through the rock, and the 2 left freely, and promptly returned to the hall of the king, which they set ablaze. Sigmund asked Signy to leave with him, at which point she revealed that Sinfiotli is his son, and that she had plotted all of these years for vengeance against her husband. She finds contentment in knowing that the deed had been done, but she believes that her life was spent in the process, and she now must die in the flames alongside her husband. Sigmund takes the throne and marries Borghild, who gives birth to his son, Helgi. When Helgi was of age, he desired to marry Sigrun, daughter of King Hogni. However, Sigrun was betrothed to King Hrothbrod, so naturally, Helgi and Sinfiotli invade Hrothbrod's realm, Helgi usurps his kingship, and then marries Sigrun. Sinfiotli also finds a woman that he desires to marry, but he must kill a competing suitor in order to secure her hand. It turns out that this suitor was actually Borghild's brother. In vengeance, she poisons and kills Sinfiotli, leading Sigmund to cast her out. In his old age, Sigmund married another, named Hjordis, much to the anger of King Lyngvi, who also sought her hand. Lyngvi attacked Sigmund, and in the midst of the battle, Odin appeared, armed with his spear to make divine intervention. Sigmund struck Odin's spear shaft with his sword, but the blade shattered on impact as this mysterious spearman vanished. That evening, Hjordis found the languishing Sigmund on the battlefield among the slain. Sigmund informs Hjordis that she is carrying a son in her womb, and tells her to guard the shards of the sword that was broken. Shortly thereafter, Prince Alf of Denmark arrives and collects spoils from the battlefield and Hjordis for his wife. She gives birth to Sigurd, son of Sigmund, who is raised in the Danish court. Sigurd grows to be strong and valiant in the tradition of his fathers, and eventually his tutor Regin reveals to him the story of Fafnir the dragon, who we come to find is in fact Regin's brother, who killed their father to secure a great treasure for himself. As C.S. Lewis said of Eustace Scrubb's dragoning, sleeping on a dragon's hoard with greedy, dragonish thoughts in his heart, he had become a dragon himself. Thus we have Fafnir the dragon, who would find no Aslan to remove his scales. Regin reforges the sword of Odin that was broken, thereby providing Sigurd with a legendary sword known as Gram. Before facing off with the dragon, Sigurd uses his sword for vengeance, slaying his father's killers. With this duty fulfilled, he faces off with the dragon, which he readily dispatches before liberating its great wealth, including the dreaded Helm of Fear. He roasts the dragon's heart, and when its enchanting blood touches his mouth, he gains wisdom, which now allows him to understand the speech of birds. Sigmund hears the birds discussing how Regin intends to betray Sigmund, so Sigmund acts preemptively and strikes Regin down. With great wealth and power, Sigurd goes to Frankish lands and vows to marry the Valkyrie, Brynhild. However, the sorceress Grimhild bewitches Sigurd into forgetting about Brynhild, so he would marry her daughter, Gudrun, and she also tells her son Gunnar to marry Brynhild. Sigurd and the 3 sons of Grimhild go to King Budli, father of Brynhild, so that Gunnar may ask for her hand in marriage. Brynhild is in a hall surrounded by fire, and will only marry one who is brave enough to ride through the flames, as she believes that only her Sigurd would perform such a feat. She is correct, but Sigurd, still bewitched, knows nothing of his connection to Brynhild. So, in service to Gunnar, they switch appearances, and Sigmund, appearing as Gunnar, passes through the flames and secures her hand in marriage for Gunnar. Brynhild eventually discovers what happened, and she falls into deep despair, only desiring to wed the great and courageous Sigurd. Attempting to deal with this problem, Gunnar gives his brother wolf and snake meat, which sends him into a violent rage with which he stabbed the sleeping Sigurd. Before dying, Sigurd throws Gram and cleaves his assailant in 2. Brynhild tells Gunnar that what he did was wrong, and she stabs herself in despair and dies. Grimhild orders Gudrun, Sigurd's widow, to marry King Atli, also known as Attila the Hun, who proves himself to be treacherous. Under false pretenses, Gunnar and his brother Hogni are summoned to the court of King Atli, who desires the treasure of Sigurd. Hogni's heart is cut out, and Gunnar is bound and cast into a pit of snakes. Gudrun is able to give Gunnar a harp, which he plays with his toes, sending all the serpents into a slumber, except for one, which bites his heart and proves his doom. In retaliation, Gudrun kills Atli's sons and feeds their blood and hearts to their father. Gudrun and Hogni's son, Niflung, then stabs Atli while he's sleeping and sets his court ablaze. Feeling her life spent by this point, Gudrun attempts to cast herself into the sea, but she was carried by the waves to the fortress of King Jonukr, whom she married and bore 3 sons, who were raised alongside Svanhild, her daughter by means of Sigurd. Svanhild was exceedingly beautiful, and her hand was desired of King Jormunrek, but she instead marries his son, Ranver. In response, Jormunrek has his son hanged, and Svanhild trampled by horses. In revenge, Gudrun's sons cut off Jormunrek's hands and feet, but he calls for his housecarls, who, with Odin's guidance, kills Gudrun's sons. And so ends the saga of the Volsungs. This presentation of the Saga of the Volsungs was originally part of my course called Life, Death, and Meaning with Beowulf and Boethius. At the time of this recording, you can purchase the course in full at andrewsnyder.podia.com, although it will soon be moving to Patreon. For the latest updates, follow Mythic Mind on Patreon at patreon.com/mythicmind, or feel free to reach out to me at mythicmindpodcast@gmail.com or on X at Andrew N. Snyder.